So I'm going to show you how to begin your value scales. First things first is, if you haven't figured this out yet, if we haven't covered it already, you will be using a 3-part solution of linseed oil, liquid, and Gamsol. I'm going to be putting it into a small container right here, but you will be putting it into one of your lidded glass jars, and you will keep those mixtures labeled with your name on the outside of it in the fire safe cabinet. First things first, I'm going to add with my palette knife, and then about the same amount of linseed oil. Remember, you want it equal thirds. And then finally the same amount of the Gamsol, which is basically just like turpentine, and you will hear me refer to it as terp for a while. Just know that when I say turpentine, I mean Gamsol. Now I'm just going to mix it all together evenly, and if it's too watery, you probably don't have your ratio correct. So I'm going to add a little bit more of the liquid. Wipe my palette knife clean. So I'm going to go ahead and start with black. I'm going to dip my brush into the mixture. Not too much, just enough so that your black is liquid. And then I'm going to fill my black square in. Now, I am hunched over my palette so that I could get the camera to show what I'm doing. So mine may be a little messier than I want you guys to be. So do your best to stay within the lines and to be fairly even. And while I'm at it, I'll go ahead and do my black for my 10-step. You can see that I've already outlined the value scales. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 10. This is paper white, so you will leave that blank. This is black, so you will just use straight black. Also, if you'll notice, in the 5-step, your midtone is dead center, but in the 10-step, you have to divide that midtone by the 2 in the middle. So we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So, since I've got black and since I've got white, I'm going to jump to the middle and mix a perfect half black, half white mixture for my midtone. So using my palette knife, I'm going to add a little bit of white over here and a little bit of black, and mix them just as I showed you before. Now when I look at it, I can kind of step back from it and blur my vision a little bit and decide, is it too dark or is it too light or is it perfect? And for me, it's a little dark, so I'm going to add a little bit more white. Clean off my palette knife, add a little bit of white. I think that's a pretty good midtone. So, clean off my palette knife. Use my Gamsol mixture here to clean my brush to get the black out of it. Or you can use a completely new brush so that you don't cross-contaminate. So now I'm going to use that. A little bit of mixed medium there. And I'm going to lay it down on my canvas. So you can see that it's a little bit streaky. I think that means that I have too much of the Gamsol in it, probably from when I was cleaning my brush out. That's okay, because I can just come back and try to get some of that turpentine Gamsol out of there to dry the brush up just a bit. Use some of my medium. Okay, that's fairly good. Now, since I've got the mid-tone color already mixed, it's probably a good idea for me to make use of that. So if I know that this is the midtone and that down here the midtone has to be divided in half, then I know that this will be the midtone plus a little bit of black, and this will be the midtone plus a little bit of white. So I'm going to start dark, and I'm going to take my color that I've got for the midtone in the 5-step, and I'm going to add just a little bit of black, just a tiny bit, just enough to darken it. And I'm going to fill in that square. Again, I have too much Gamsol in my mixture, and that's why it's so watery. You don't want that. Now you'll notice that for the most part I am mixing my colors and my values with my palette knife. You don't typically want to mix your values or your colors with your brush, because then that just messes up your brushes and you end up having to buy new ones. You know, I'm all about saving money. Okay, so you can see how this is the midtone just a tiny bit darker, and now I'm going to do the other side of the midtone, which is a tiny bit lighter than this 5-step midtone, which means I'm going to add a little bit more white to the mixture. So you want to make sure that you fill in each square evenly. So since I've finished with the midtone, I have the lighter version of the midtone and the darker version of the midtone. Now I'm skipping over to the middle of what's left on the dark side of the value scale. And I'm finding basically what you could consider the midtone between black and midtone, if that makes any sense. So you're looking at the shades now versus the lights. And you can always go lighter or darker, because the good thing about oil paint is you can always mix it back in whatever you need and paint over it. And if it's still wet, you can paint within it. So what I like to do is check myself ever so often and make sure that I'm on the right track by stepping back a little bit and giving myself some distance from the canvas and blurring my vision a little bit to see if I'm dark or light enough. And I think that's probably a good happy medium between this value and that value. And for the rest, you will need to find what's in between this and this, here, here, and then these three. So remember, starting from white, going all the way to black, starting from white, going all the way to black. The difference is that in a 5-step, you're gonna have bigger jumps between values, but it should still be an even progression. In the 10-step, you'll see more of a gradual change, but there still should be a little bit of a difference between each one as you progressively get darker. Now, what I don't want you to do is make it black and smear it this way, and then use white and smear it that way, because that's not what I'm looking for. So once you're done with everything, go back with your paper white squares and add just pure white, and then let everything dry. So once you're finished, the way that you clean your brushes before you get to the soap is this tank should be somewhat full of just your Gamsol. And just like I showed you guys with your hand or on your palette to do this back and forth, you're going to do the same thing in the bottom of this with your Gamsol. And then once you think it's clear enough and clean enough, it's not going to get perfect, you're going to want to dry it off as much as possible on your rag, and then you take it to the sink and you use the soap for the rest of the way. And so once the soap has cleaned it and the water is running through, you're all done. Now if you want to make it nicer, you can always use painter's tape or frog tape. Frog tape is green, painter's tape is blue. Painter's tape's a little bit cheaper than frog tape, but supposedly frog tape works better. But you can put that around your boxes and fill them in as you go, and that way you get a nice clean edge.